Good afternoon. I see that people are still walking in and getting seated comfortably. I'm so glad you're here. Welcome. My name is Mary Weaver Chapin. I'm your curator of prints and drawings here at the Portland Art Museum. And it is my distinct pleasure today to welcome our speaker, Dr. Susan Dackerman. Susan is an adjunct professor at the University of Southern California and a scholar at the Getty Research Institute. Prior to moving west, Susan was the Carl A. Weyerhaeuser Curator of Prints at the Harvard Art Museums from 2005 to 2014. Now, much of Susan's scholarship is focused on the emergence of the modern print about 500 years ago, the age of Albrecht Dürer and his contemporaries. Susan has been widely praised for her exhibitions and publications, including Painted Prints, the revelation of color in Northern European engravings, etchings, and woodcuts, and the award-winning Prints in the Pursuit of Knowledge in Early Modern Europe, which examined the role that artists played in the scientific investigations of the 16th century. Now, if at about this point you're starting to worry you're in the wrong auditorium, don't get up yet. Susan is one of the rare scholars who has won awards for her work on two areas completely removed from each other, the art of the Renaissance and the art of today. In about 2005, Susan began investigating the work of Corita Kent, a brilliant but overlooked figure of the pop art movement. After 10 years of research, her work culminated in the exhibition and catalog. I show you here her masterful catalog, Corita Kent and the Language of Pop. It opened at the Harvard Art Museums and traveled to the San Antonio Museum of Art. Her show explored the influence of pop art and Vatican II on the prints of Kent and her contemporaries, Andy Warhol, Ed Ruscha, and Robert Indiana, amongst others. In November, just last month, Susan was awarded the prestigious IFPDA Book Award for the Best New Publication on Prints. Now, if that's not remarkable enough, this was her second time winning. The first was for a publication on the 16th century, and then she jumped to the 20th century. So I want to know what happens in the 400 years in between. I regret to say that Susan's book is presently sold out of our gift shop. It's a remarkable work. It's on order, but we keep selling them and people keep buying them, so I regret it isn't here today. But we are delighted to have the real deal, to have Susan Dackerman address us on Corita Kent and the Language of Pop. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you, Mary. That was a very generous introduction. And thank you, everyone, for coming here on a Sunday afternoon. This is a much bigger crowd than I expected. So I'm delighted that you're all here. So as Mary said, my academic field is actually 16th century Northern Europe. But I want to tell you a bit about how I became acquainted with the prints of Corita Kent. I had just taken a job as the print curator at the Harvard Art Museums, and one of my colleagues there asked me if I wanted to see a group of prints that his mother had that had been made by a nun in Los Angeles in the 1960s. His sister had been one of her students, and I thought, oh no. This is one of those Antiques Roadshow moments where one has to say something nice. But he ended up bringing in these stack of prints, and they were by Corita Kent. And the name rang a bell, even though I had just moved to Boston. And what I knew about Corita Kent, which, believe me, made looking at the prints seem like it was going to be even worse, was that she had painted the gas tank for the city of Boston. So Boston's supply of liquid natural gas is stored in this tank. It's along the expressway south of the city. Everyone sees it. It's a huge landmark. When they talk about the traffic on the news in the morning, you know, they say the backup starts at the tanks, and everyone knows what they mean. And there's a lot of lore in the city about the tank, because when she finished having them, she didn't do the painting herself, clearly. She made the design, and then sign painters went up and painted the tank. But when it was completed, people began to talk about how they saw the profile of Ho Chi Minh in this blue stripe. 1971 was, of course, a difficult year in the Vietnam War, and this created quite a bit of controversy in the city. People wanted the tank taken down, or not taken down, but the painting taken down. She says that she denied that it had anything to do with Ho Chi Minh, which I believe entirely. But this is how the tank is known in Boston. And so I was being brought these prints by this artist whose work I only knew in this somewhat circuitous way. Now, when they were brought to me and I got to see them, I was amazed by how fantastic they were and that I didn't know them already. I had been the curator of the print collection in Baltimore, and as the curator, I was responsible for the prints from the Renaissance through the Contemporary, but I had never seen any of this work by Corita Kent. I, of course, knew the pop prints of her contemporaries, Andy Warhol, Ed Ruscha, Robert Indiana, and one of the ways that pop art has always been talked about is as a form, a style that really privileged men. In fact, the artists who showed at the premier pop LA gallery, the Ferris Gallery, were known as the Ferris Studs. So of course, Corita wasn't among them. And, you know, they made work that had a certain edge to it. And from this very well-known pop portfolio from 1965, 11 pop artists, I mean, you can see what was valued, and what Corita Kent was doing didn't quite fall into these parameters. She was making work like this. And let me just read you what an art critic wrote in 1966 in Look magazine about the work. Quote, "Long before those young men in New York invented pop art, a small nun in Los Angeles was showing her students at Immaculate Heart College how to discover the novel and beautiful in popular magazines and packages from the supermarket. But Sister Mary Corita is a different kind of pop artist. Whereas the New York boys deal in a certain brittle archness," and then she says parenthetically, "they are chic," Sister Corita and her students unabashedly affirm and celebrate the here and now glories of God's world, the words of Beatles songs, the pictures on cereal boxes, the sheen of stamps, the typography in movie magazines. So work that was better known at that time by artists like Robert Indiana isn't as affirmative. In fact, something like this seems quite ironic and critical. And we're going to come back to these two paintings. But in relationship, Kent's work seems much more celebratory. This is a quote from an E.E. Cummings poem, "Be of love a little more careful than of everything." And of course, this is a print that is full of emotion and feeling. Now, what is often valued by art critics is a kind of toughness and intellectualness, a criticality, not emotion and feeling. And so Kent's work got lost in the critical discourse of the period and has gotten lost in the art historical discourse since then. And so this project of mine was an attempt to look at her work in relationship to the work of her contemporaries and show the shared strategies and shared influences. And hopefully that's what I'll do here today, or be able to do here today. So let me tell you a little bit about Corita Kent. She was born in 1918. She moved to Los Angeles with her family when she was 5 years old. And in 1936, upon graduating from college, entered the Roman Catholic Order of Nuns of the Immaculate Heart of Mary in Hollywood. She lived there, she studied there, and she taught there until 1968. Through the end of her life in 1986, Corita Kent made over 700 screen prints. She undertook commissions for public art projects. She undertook commissions for advertising campaigns. She wrote and designed books. She produced films. She orchestrated happenings. She was well known in her day. And in fact, she produced a mural that was installed in the Vatican Pavilion at the 1964 World's Fair in New York City. So that was the World's Fair that's famous because Michelangelo's Pieta was brought to Queens, New York, and installed there during the run of the fair. To get to the Pieta, one had to walk down a hallway and walk past Corita Kent's banner. In 1967, she was one of the LA Times Women of the Year. She was profiled in Harper's Bazaar, and she was on the cover of Newsweek as an exemplar of the modern nun. So even though her work wasn't taken up by the art world, as it were, she was well known. There's a profile of her in Talk of the Town in a 1967 New Yorker. So she's someone that had a kind of celebrity. Her early work, and there are some great examples of her work from the 1950s in the exhibition downstairs, is different in style from her later work. It is layers of dark colors screen printed onto these sheets. It has a relationship to abstract expressionism and is influenced by her interest in Byzantine art. I mean, you can see this figure here. But you could also see something modern coming out in it as well. The flashes of color and the use of language. And so there's a turning point for Corita Kent that happens in 1962, in which her work becomes essentially more modern. So let's talk about 1962 for a few minutes. It is a very important year. It's the year that the Pope announced the commencement of Vatican II, the Second Vatican Council. Many of you, I'm sure, remember the Second Vatican Council and all that was written about it quite well. But let me just rehearse some of its ambitions. The primary goal of the Second Vatican Council was to revitalize Catholicism for the modern world, to renew its liturgy and the life of Catholics in the 20th century. And so these meetings were announced in 1962 and were convened in 1963 and went until 65. The LA Times actually called the Second Vatican Council the most important meeting of the Catholic Church since the Council of Trent in the 16th century. And the Council of Trent was called in the 16th century in response to the rise of Protestantism. So, as we all know, that was a big break in the history, in the life of the Church of Rome. And so this moment in the mid-60s was very important to Vatican II as well. Now, in 1962, Corita Kent was at Immaculate Heart College. Her order there was one of the more progressive orders. It was an order that had originated in Spain in the mid-19th century to serve schools and orphanages. It started a mission in Southern California in the late 19th century to serve the Spanish-speaking community there. And the Immaculate Heart nuns, by the mid-20th century, were a liberal order that was mostly a teaching order. And so it was training the vast majority of parochial school teachers in California. And so it was a very influential order too, an order that was training people to go out to serve the community. And so the ideas of Vatican II were very interesting to many of the Immaculate Heart of Mary nuns. They were interested in a relaxation of their habits. They were interested in not being called sister, so that they weren't quite as distinctive in the community. They wanted some of that wall to come down so that their relationships would be easier. And Corita Kent was very much a participant in that worldview and was very much of the life of LA in 1962. Now, 1962 in LA was also a groundbreaking year for the art world. It was the year that a relatively unknown commercial artist from New York first showed his paintings of soup cans in a gallery in Los Angeles called the Ferris Gallery, where all the studs were. And Corita Kent was a teacher who on Friday afternoons took her students out into LA, took them to gallery shows, took them to museums to see things. And so this was a show that they saw. What Warhol did with this show was introduce everyday objects as subjects of art. And that was a profound change from the work of the previous decades. And just so I can illustrate some of those differences. So one of the most celebrated artists of that previous decade was Mark Rothko. And I'm sure you all know these paintings that are based in transcendental and existential philosophical readings. They are narrated as, their completion is narrated as being part of this struggle to create these images that then are somewhat difficult to understand. I mean, knowledge is necessary. Knowledge of a philosophical tradition is necessary to understand work like this. And then the pop artists come to the fore in the 60s, and what they're suggesting is different. That everyday objects can also be works of art. And they become known as pop art. art that's easy to understand, art that can be popular, art that is accessible to the populace. And these are well-known works. Now, you have the great luxury of seeing the screen print of the tomato soup can in the Warhol exhibition here. There's also, he also made this box that depicts, it's like a grocery store delivery box that the Campbell's tomato juice would have been delivered in. Now, the box is actually made of plywood that he has screen printed the brown color of a cardboard box to look like a cardboard box. So even though these look like everyday objects, there's actually a great deal of craft and skill that goes into their making. Now, the soup cans were first shown in 1962 at the Ferris Gallery. And in 1964, the boxes were shown for the first time in LA as well at the Dackerman Gallery. So what is Corita Kent's response to seeing these new forms of art? I think one of the things that happens is that she is wholly engaged by Warhol's use of popular subject matter. I mean, Warhol between 1962 and 1964 has actually made tomatoes and tomato food products the subject of fine art. And Corita Kent enters that fray in 1964 with this screen print that depicts, as you can see, the word tomato. It is dependent on Campbell's competitor's jingle. Del Monte's tomato sauce jingle was, "Del Monte tomatoes are the juiciest of all." So Corita Kent makes this print in which she says, and it's over here, "If we are provided with a sign that declares Del Monte tomatoes are the juiciest, is it not desecration to add, Mary Mother is the juiciest tomato of all?" And then the next line she says, "Perhaps this is what is meant when, as the slang term puts it, she's a peach, or what a tomato." So Corita Kent finds a way to use pop art to serve her ambitions for Vatican II. Now, why else, and we're going to talk more about this print, but why else would Corita Kent have thought it was okay to use tomatoes as a subject of her art? Well, in 1962, Pope John XXIII offered the encyclical Peace on Earth. And it was a letter to the Catholic community of the world that detailed what would be necessary for world peace. And one of those things was solving world hunger, that there wasn't going to be peace until everyone was fed. So food was an important component of Roman Catholic doctrine at the time, too, and something that was part of the discussions in Vatican II. Now, in 1963, across the street from the Immaculate Heart Convent and College, a supermarket emerged called Market Basket. And Corita Kent was fascinated by Market Basket, and she went over there and took slides all the time. So these are slides she took of the exterior, she took slides of the interior, and I love this slide here, of course, because she's just gone into the supermarket and made a photograph of that refers to the Andy Warhol Brillo boxes. So she's clearly aware of what Warhol is doing. But the tomato allows her to re-articulate a representation of the Virgin Mary, one in modern language, one in that fits with the modern world, and one that I would argue is aligned with what the ambitions of Vatican II were espousing. Now, this print was not very well received by the Cardinal in Los Angeles. Unfortunately, the Immaculate Heart Convent and College was in one of the most conservative archdioceses in the country. And so she and the other nuns in Immaculate Heart came under attack, or at least, well, yes, attack in the wake of their art production, Corita's art production, and other projects that they undertook. But it's important to say that the more general Catholic community wasn't all totally critical. So in 1965, the following year, the National Catholic Register, the National Catholic Reporter, National Catholic Reporter, the newspaper, in its Christmas edition, included a fold-out reproduction of the tomato print as a gift to its readership. So it did have a following. Now, you'll see that what Kent has done, she's reduced tomato products to language, which is not what Warhol did. Warhol depicted the packaging. Kent, instead, has taken these words and changed their meaning. And there was a lot of that happening in the 60s among other artists. So again, this is to show you that Kent is not alone in what she's doing. So here I'm showing you on the top two details from the 1959 painting False Start by Jasper Johns, a print of his in the lower right called Red, Yellow, and Blue, a lithograph, and then a slide that Corita Kent took in 1965 at Jasper Johns' first retrospective at the Pasadena Museum. And you'll see in both the painting and the print, Johns has depicted words, language. You can see the word orange in the upper left, the word red in the upper right. And neither of these words are depicted in the color that they signify. And it's something it was a way that artists were playing with language at the time. They were taking it and investing it with new language, and that was very much a big part of Corita Kent's work. So much of the language that she found was in advertisements. So this is an advertisement for Canada Dry's drink mixers with the slogan, "Give the gang our best." And you can see that she's taken those words and made them the basis of this print. Now, I'm going to take a moment just to tell you how she made this print. So this is a screen print, which means that to make it, a screen is placed over a sheet of paper and ink is pushed through that screen to color the paper. Now, the designs are applied to the screen in different ways. So here in Give the Gang Our Best, what's happened is Corita Kent has taken a slide of the words "Give the Gang Our Best" from the advertisement. She has projected them onto the wall and enlarged them, and then traced that on a piece of paper. She then cuts the letters out, and they become the sheet with the cutout letters becomes a stencil through which she can push that black ink onto the sheet of paper through the stencil. And of course, the stencil blocks the black ink from going elsewhere. So that's the primary register of ink that she uses. Now, most of her work from this period, there are two registers of text, this primary register, and then as you can see in the mustard rectangle and the blue circle, there are other texts. And those texts usually come from literature, philosophy, other sources. I mean, they come from sources as, I don't want to use the words would be playful. They come from Winnie the Pooh. They come from song lyrics. These texts happen to be the writings of Daniel Berrigan, who was a radical Jesuit priest in the 60s who was friends with Corita Kent. And he would send her writing and contributions, things for her to include in her prints, as she does here. Now, to get that text onto the sheet of paper, it first has to be on the screen. And you'll notice that the text is actually white. So that's the white of the paper. So that means she hasn't cut out a stencil, but what she's done is taken a stylus or a pen and put some kind of varnish on it and drawn directly on the screen. That varnish dries, and then it blocks ink from going through it. So instead, she then rolls the blue and the mustard color in at different times. She pushes those colors across the screen, and it makes the surrounding. So the smaller text is actually in the negative, where the dark text is in the positive. But her work often has this negative-positive effect. And the two texts often have something to do with one another. Now, she talks about that in a book called Footnotes and Headlines. And so you can think about those two registers of text as a footnote and a headline. And here, this is a page from the book is in the exhibition, in which she says, in a way, all the words we need are in the ads. And so she's not making those words up herself. She's taking those words from the most popular, the most well-known sites, Life magazine, Newsweek. And so for this project that I did with a team of art historians, we went and we looked through Life magazine's Newsweek and tried to find these ads, and we found that she actually even took things from Playboy. I mean, she really was Catholic in her reading. Now, she wasn't the only one who was manipulating text in this way. So here's another one of her prints with the text coming from a Vogue magazine, from an advertisement for Klopman fabrics, and their tagline was, Klopman, a man you can lean on. And she takes that man you can lean on, and it becomes the central figure of this print on the left. It's printed over the words turn, turn, song lyrics by Pete Seeger, and suggests something very different from what the Vogue ad intended to suggest. So she's taking language and she's investing it with new meaning. She's also giving it a real physical presence. So, as I said before, she photographs these ads and projects them, and then traces them. She can manipulate the paper and the image so that it seems she can fold it and She would lay it over stairs, so it has these twists and turns in it, and so it has a real three-dimensional presence in a way. You can see in the print on the right next to it by Ed Ruscha that he gives text that kind of physical presence too. And there's an art historian who wrote recently that Ed Ruscha's interest in language comes from his Catholic upbringing. He was very interested in the word becoming flesh. And it goes right to the heart of what Corita Kent does. She makes the word become flesh. So a man you can lean on, even though she doesn't say it's we all know it's not Klopman, but even though she doesn't say it's Christ or God or any divine figure, we know that that's what she has in mind. She does it again here. So this print, titled Handle with Care, in the background you can see the words, "See the man who can save you the most." It took us forever to find this ad, but we found it. See the man who could save you the most, and it was your Chevy dealer. So she takes language, she takes this very popular language that everyone is familiar with, and she turns it to the uses of Vatican II, to bring the divine world into the present. And to give the divine a kind of presence as well as being present. So one imagines the man who can save you the most as a 60s car salesman in, one of those Mad Men suits. It's a very different image of divinity. Now, Kent knew what she was doing. And in 1966, she said, when someone drew a picture of Pope John wearing an Avis We Try Harder button, those words no longer meant which car rental to patronize, and yet some of the overtones from its original meaning are there and make a contribution to the new situation. Now, Kent wasn't the only one using affirmative language. Robert Indiana made one of the most iconic images of the pop art movement. It was a commission that the Museum of Modern Art asked him to make, their 1965 Christmas card. Robert Indiana was raised in the Christian Science church. And so his childhood was spent in churches where there were no pictures, but printed on the walls were the words, "God is love." Now, I took a walk this morning around the corner and passed a Christian Science church on Park and Columbia, and they had a big sign out front that said, "God is love." It seemed like a sign. So, Robert Indiana, too, is very interested in the way that language can be used to convey certain ideas. And his work has this underlying religious quality. Even when he says eat and die, which seem ironic, critical, if you think about them in terms of his background, his history, they also can speak to ideas of communion and resurrection. Just something to think about. Now, a lot of artists were interested in food, so someone like Jim Dine is making a series of prints here called Vegetables. This is one of 9 prints in this series. But like Corita, he's interested in the depiction of food and language and the way that it can be divested of its meaning. So he plays these games where clearly this is an eggplant and it says carrot. This rutabaga, eggplant. He two is taking the meaning out of words. Kent does it here for sure when she uses the General Mills slogan, the big G stands for goodness. Again, she was very interested in groceries and food products and what could be conveyed, what kind of meaning could be conveyed through them. She was especially interested in bread and the idea of Wonder Bread was particularly significant to her. So her earliest pop print, to my mind, is this one, and it depicts the circles that were on the Wonder Bread wrapping in the Wonder Bread palette, and she just calls it Wonder Bread. Now, Corita Kent had a gallery in New York, down in Greenwich Village, where she had a show every winter. And we know that she saw Warhol's work. But we also know that Warhol saw her work, because one of the nuns that accompanied her in, I think it's 1965, to her exhibition, wrote in her memoir, "The opening is crowded with fans. Andy Warhol is there. He would be captivated by the idea of an artist nun, especially one who uses Wonder Bread wrapping as a symbol for the Eucharist." So, you know, Warhol was raised Catholic, and that was one of his struggles through his life. And Kent and her sister nuns knew that. But more importantly, what Kent was trying to say, that any bread could be holy. It didn't have to just be a very particularized bread that anyone could buy, that the divine was open to anyone who could go into a grocery store. Now, the strategies and the ambitions of pop art and Vatican II, though they seem that they would be very different, are actually aligned in many ways. So there is a scholar, Colleen McDaniel, who described Vatican II as privileging the following ideas: reform, relevancy, experimentation, collaboration, youthfulness, intentionality, openness, humor, protest, and the vernacular. Richard Hamilton, an artist who is known for his work in pop, called pop art popular, transient, expendable, low-cost, mass-produced, young, witty, sexy, gimmicky, glamorous, big business. There's a lot of overlap between those two descriptions. And Corita Kent taps right into that, and so she makes prints like this one, again dependent on a Del Monte jingle, Make Meatballs Sing, in which Psalm 98 is actually printed here in this other register. But it does what many of her prints do. They say one thing that you can read from afar, and then you get up close and you're offered something related but different. And so that kind of popularity, that gimmicky quality is what draws one in. Now, she not only made images that involved pop art, she also had these celebrations at the college that were engaged in a similar kind of celebration of pop. And you can see here the nuns carrying signs, many of them advertisements that have come from the supermarket across the street. And this is one of the prints made in the wake of those celebrations from the campus. And it has a great quote at its center here. And it's one of the other nuns at the college had said this. And it was, she had been asked by a student, what would the Virgin Mary think if she were here today, if she could see this pop art celebration if she could see what we were doing. And one of the other nuns said, "Mary does laugh, and she sings and she runs and she wears bright orange. Today she'd probably do her shopping at the market basket." And there it is again. So there's always that push and pull. There's something familiar, but something that brings you back to the divine. Now, Kent's work and life changed drastically in the later years of the 60s. The political landscape changed her work dramatically. Much of it became about the Vietnam War and civil rights. She was someone who said that she didn't march. She wasn't an activist, but what she did was made art. And she made art that spoke to the issues of the day and used popular images and songs to get there. And so this print is called Yellow Submarine from the Beatles song. And she was very interested in the Beatles. And one of her students gave her a new way to look at them. She said, "A boy at our school, a music major, wrote a paper on the history of salvation according to Paul, Ringo, George, and John. He says the whole history of man is a kind of love affair between God and man, and the words of the Beatles songs are often very similar in content to scripture words. They have a freshness in that context." And so she was always looking for new ways to bring scripture forward, and in this case, to comment on the world events around her. She was also devastated by the tragedies of the assassinations of John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King, and Robert F. Kennedy, and made work in support of the civil rights movement, as you can see here. And again, she wasn't the only artist who was doing that at the time. Andy Warhol was also making work in that vein. Again, this is downstairs. I didn't know so many of my images I would be lucky enough that they would be on view at the museum, where it's well worth taking a look at them. But I want to end with this, because this is up downstairs, and I think that it's a particularly powerful print of hers. Now, Power Up was the slogan of the Richfield Oil Company. So you drove into a gas station and you were invited to pump gas and power up. It is a phrase that she combines with a very detailed text on the bottom here. And that text is by Daniel Berrigan, and it's about the power of bread. And bread both as a food and as something that nourishes the spirit. And what I think Kent is suggesting here is the power, the potency, the power of bread to help one power up, both in terms of its physical manifestation and its symbolic power. And Kent says about this print, "Power Up stops being only a sign about gasoline and starts talking about bread that gives man's heart strength. The word powers up and bread powers up." Now, in 1964, a priest who said a mass at Immaculate Heart combined Power Up, or displayed Power Up over the altar. So on either side of the altar, though, are Open Life magazines, which, as we know, were the source of much of Corita's text-based work. And one of them, the one on the left, shows the Chapel of Primacy of Peter on the Sea of Galilee and Pope Paul VI kissing the rock there, referring to Vatican II. And on the right, there is it's open to a spread from Life magazine that details the Harlem riots. New York's Negro ghetto erupts. And so it all gets pulled together. It's a combination of religion, politics, spirituality in this uplifting mode. And I think one of the reasons that her work is finding such an audience these days is that we're in a moment where we need artists like her. We need artists to offer a vision, something positive for us to follow a kind of politics that offer this kind of uplift and fairness. So I'm going to leave you on that note. Corita Kent left the Order of the Immaculate Heart of Mary in 1968. She left Los Angeles. She left teaching, and she moved to Boston, where she took the commission of the tank. And I have to admit that after the years of research and looking at the work and reading her words, I actually now find this one of the most moving objects in Boston. I think it's her pop art gift to the city, in much the same way that the Hollywood sign is a pop art landmark in Los Angeles. And the Immaculate Heart Convent was right below that sign. You could see it up in the hills. And I think she had that in mind when she thought, I can give Boston something, an icon. And it's what it's become in the city. So thank you very much for being here today. And I hope you have a chance to see the exhibition downstairs. Thank you. Now, I'm happy to take questions, and there are microphones in the audience if people would like to ask a question.
Thanks. Hello. Thanks so much for your talk. It was great. I first saw that Boston tank up close when I was driving on that highway at night in the rain, and my friend made me pull over in a breakdown lane there to see the Ho Chi Minh, which was life-threatening, but it was powerful in a lot of ways.
Yep.
So my uncredentialed opinion or feeling about it has always been very strong, and that it was very intentional. So I was surprised to hear you say, and I'm curious about why you say that you think it was unintentional.
Well, she doesn't do anything like that anywhere else. I mean, she, first of all, denies that Ho Chi Minh is there. But she doesn't do anything else like it. And I actually think its gestures are more closely related to the gestures of pop art than to political activism. So one of the subjects of pop art becomes the instruments of making art itself. So Jim Dine makes depictions of paintbrushes. Roy Lichtenstein makes depictions of brushstrokes. And I think that this is more closely related to that than to a kind of covert activism. It just wasn't her way. She was more she was more explicit than that. It was out there in words rather than hidden in pictures. Now, the tank is now under the supervision of Homeland Security because it is Boston's gas supply. So now you can't pull over and take pictures of it any longer, which we discovered when we were doing the catalog. Yeah, the toy film is actually an Eames film, but it's very much related to her films. So she and the Eameses were very friendly in Los Angeles, and then a series of films, or a number of films, were made about her. She would show her students the Eames films, and then students of hers made these documentary films about her. You can actually find them online. They are so worth watching. One is called Mary's Day, and the other is called There Is No Art. But yes, she is the films about her are well worth watching.
I have a mic.
Okay.
I understand that in Europe, particularly in Germany, people like Seymour Polk would label their work capitalist realism. And that was their version of pop. And I'm wondering, since words matter, I guess, I'm wondering if there's any subtle difference in attitude between pop artists and capitalist realist artists.
It's a good question. And I think besides the German pop artists, Warhol and Rouchet, their work has also been talked about as a kind of capitalist critique. It's a way of making us hyper-aware of commodity culture to the point where we tire of it. So it's a fine line, though. It can be both viewed as a critique of capitalist culture as well as a complete indulgence in capitalist culture. Now, there's a way to talk about Corita's prints and her relationship to commodity culture that I think is very interesting, because advertising in the 50s took a lot from scripture. They took a lot of the advertising was based on the ideas or resonated with ideas from biblical teaching. So, Dove soap, the Dove piece, the You're in Good Hands insurance company. I can't remember which insurance company is. 3-in-1 oil to anoint your engine with. So Corita was very much aware of how those words had been co-opted by Madison Avenue, and she was interested in taking them back and giving them new meaning, and therefore making it a critique of capitalism and commodity culture, if that answers your question.
Thank you so much for this presentation. It's illuminating and inspiring.
Thank you.
I have a question that ties into a talk Blake Gopnik gave recently at the museum on Andy Warhol's screen prints. And since you go back to the Renaissance, maybe you can clarify this. He said that the screen printing process was invented in America. It was quintessentially American in 1938. And I posted this on a blog which has a small but international following. And an art teacher in England wrote back and said, the silk screen process has indeed been invented several times over. Some of the earliest applications can be found in medieval Japan, but it appeared in Europe in the 18th century, particularly in France, for stenciling patterns on fabric and objects like shoes. So can you give the historical perspective?
No, I can't. honestly, but I can tell you where you can find it. There is a brand new book on the history of screen printing that I bet details that history. Now, I'm sure that the idea of pushing ink or paint through a screen has been in use for centuries. So I would refute the 1938 invention. Like, I'm not surprised at all that there is the idea of other iterations of that technique. I just can't tell you specifically when the first one was or what its history is. And I'm not sure that they would be related, that if it was, as you said, screen printing is probably invented over and over and over in Japan and the United States. But I would be interested, and I will be interested, to go and read that history of screen printing to avoid this, not knowing this question the next time. Thank you.
Could you tell us the circumstances under which she left the convent, and did she also leave the church?
She did leave the church, and I can't tell you the circumstances. She never articulated them publicly. But I think after all those years of critique and the hard work she had enough. Like it had become clear to her, I think, that the church wasn't going to change as profoundly as she wanted, as the promises suggested, and she left the church and moved to Boston and continued to make art, and then existed for the rest of her life until she died in 1986 as an artist. So, all right, maybe this is the last question. I'm seeing people. Please.
Thank you so much for your presentation and your knowledge. I was curious about her personal life. Do you know anything about her family or about her personal life and how that affected her artwork?
She came from an Irish family with, I think that there were 5 siblings. She and one of her sisters also became a nun and were in the same order at Immaculate Heart. And she had a brother who was a priest, ordained as a priest. But her sister, who was also the nun, was a very traditional conservative nun and remained with the order after Corita left. So her history and how it affected her work. I think she was most affected by her life in the convent. I think that became her family, even though she did maintain ties with her siblings. After she left the convent, one of her sisters ran a gallery in Los Angeles that sold her prints. But I think it was the structure of the convent, the print workshop there where she made the prints with students and the other nuns that made her work as good as it was, as sharp as it was. And in fact, after she left and continued to make prints into the 70s, they lose that edginess. They become more sentimental, softer. She's no longer in conversation with the high art world, and I think that convent provided a family for her that, once lost, really changed her life. Thank you, everyone, for coming.